Once upon a time, there was a successful author named John. John had written several bestsellers and was loved by his fans for his unique storytelling. However, John found himself struggling to come up with new ideas for his next book. The deadline for his manuscript was fast approaching, and he was running out of time. John had heard rumors of a mysterious stranger who could help writers overcome creative blocks. One evening, as he sat alone at his desk, he decided to seek out the stranger's help. John journeyed through the dark, foggy night to find the stranger's isolated cabin in the woods. Upon knocking on the stranger's door, an eerily tall and thin man with a deep voice greeted him. The stranger introduced himself as Lucius and offered to help John find inspiration for his next book. John was eager to discover Lucius' secret formula, and the two men spent the evening discussing writing techniques and storytelling. Eventually, Lucius offered John a deal. His next book would be an international bestseller, but in exchange, Lucius would own John's soul. At first, John laughed at the suggestion. He thought it was merely a joke. However, as the night wore on, he realized that Lucius was serious about his offer. The stranger then pulled out a contract, and John was shocked to find that Lucius seemed to have already written out an agreement and the consequences of breaking it. Excitement now clouded his judgment as John grabbed the contract, signed it without reading it and handed it over to Lucius, believing that this was the only way he would be able to come up with a new story. As the days passed, John was amazed by how he could write page after page. He finished his manuscript in record time, but it was darker and more twisted than any of his previous works. It was when his book was published that he finally realized the gravity of the deal he had made with Lucius. John's book earned him worldwide fame, but it also caused harm and destruction in the world. The storyline he wrote was not his own, but was given to him by none other than the devil himself, who wanted John's soul as his next victim. John became increasingly paranoid as he realized the outcome of his impulsive decision. He saw the devil in his every shadow, heard his whispers in every sound, and began to fear for his life. He sought help from different people, but no one could save him from his fate. In the end, John's soul was claimed by the devil, and his legacy was forever tainted by the price he paid for his success. In the small town of Derry, Maine, there lived a renowned author named James. James had been writing books for the past 20 years, and his name was well known in the literary world for his captivating stories and unique writing style that could transport readers to a different world. However, his latest book was unlike anything he had ever written before. For this book, James decided to take a break from his usual genre and dabble in science fiction. He wanted to write a story that would take readers on a journey to a parallel universe. James worked tirelessly on his new book for months, pouring all of his creativity and energy into it. But something strange started happening as he wrote. Every time James wrote something in his book, it would somehow become real in the world around him. At first, he thought it was just his imagination, but as he continued to write, more and more of his creations came to life. James wrote about a flying car, and a few days later, he saw one on the street. He wrote about a talking dog, and his neighbor's pet suddenly began speaking. He wrote about a world without gravity, and suddenly, everything in his house started floating. At first, James was excited about the power he had discovered. He could make his wildest dreams come true with just a few words on a page. But as he delved deeper into his newfound ability, he began to realize that his power had unintended consequences. For every good thing that came to life, there were also negative consequences. James knew that he had to be careful and use his power responsibly. He started writing stories about love, compassion, and peace, hoping to make the world a better place. He also made sure to test his new creations in a controlled environment to avoid any potential harm. But despite his best efforts, James couldn't control everything. His characters and creations had a life of their own, and sometimes they didn't behave the way he wanted them to. The world he had created was full of dangers and risks that he hadn't anticipated. James realized that he had created a monster. His power had become a curse, and he couldn't escape it. He was trapped in his own story, and he didn't know how to get out. Over time, James learned to master his power and use it for good. But the experience had changed him. He no longer trusted his own mind or his own writing. He had seen the dark side of his imagination, and it had left a mark on him that he could never erase. James's latest book became a bestseller, and people all over the world marveled at his creativity and imagination. But James knew the truth. He had created not just a story, but a world that was beyond his control. And he would never be the same again.
I hope you enjoy the content I upload. If you like what I'm doing, why not think about clicking on the subscribe button to keep up to date on my uploads. Thank you all for the great support.
Once, in a small town tucked away in the countryside, there lived a man named Mark who was a master of horror. His words could conjure up terrors so visceral that they would haunt readers long after the last page had been turned. The locals whispered that he was possessed by a dark muse, that he had made a deal with the devil himself to be able to write such terrifying tales. His latest book, The Mysterious Murders, was causing quite a stir. People would line up outside the bookstore to get their hands on a copy of the macabre masterpiece. Little did they know that the book would soon become a living nightmare. One by one, the murders from the book began to come to life, and the townspeople found themselves trapped in a real-life horror story. Bodies were found, mutilated and left in similar locations as those described in the book. Panic and terror spread like a wildfire through the streets, and the townspeople were left to fend for themselves against an unknown, unrelenting evil. The police were baffled. They had never encountered anything like this before. The murders were matching the pages of the novel, and they had no leads on who the killer could be. Fear gripped the town, and the streets were deserted at night. The investigation finally led them to Mark. They found several notes and scribbles in his notebook about the murders and how they could be executed. They also discovered that he had been seen around the murder scenes during the times when the killings were committed. The evidence was stacked against him, and Mark was taken into custody. His trial was the talk of the town, and the residents were convinced that the author had brought the book to life and was responsible for the horrors they had experienced. But Mark denied all allegations against him. He insisted that someone was framing him. He claimed that he had no motive or intention to hurt anyone, and that the book was just a work of fiction. Despite his protests, he was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. The town was finally at peace, but some still wonder what truly happened and if Mark was, in fact, guilty of the horrific crimes that plagued the town. For those who believe in the supernatural, they say that Mark's words were so powerful that they had conjured up a malevolent force that couldn't be contained by the pages of a book. They believe that he had tapped into something dark and unknowable, and that he had brought about his own downfall.